What's going on YouTube? It's Braxtech again, finally, after quite some time. Today I finally have another laptop to share with you guys. It is the MSI Vector 16HX AI. I apologize for the mouthful of a name. But this one is rocking the latest architecture from both Intel and NVIDIA. So we have the Core Ultra 9 275HX, which has dropped hyper-threading. There's some architectural changes that make it much more efficient, as you'll see later in the tests. But slightly more latency when it comes to memory-sensitive things like gaming and things like that. It also has the latest architecture from NVIDIA, which has been hit or miss in terms of the public eye, but it is a RTX 5080 running at 175 watts, rocking 16 gigs of VRAM, GDDR7, so there's a nice little bump in bandwidth there. This specific model has 16 gigs of system memory, running at 5600 megahertz in dual channel. However, it is replaceable. It's not soldered, which I highly recommend anybody who buys this SKU to just drop in another 32 gig kit, and 1 terabyte of Gen 4 NVMe storage, which overall for the price point, I think the specs are pretty stacked. I know the chassis is mostly plastic and is reused from the last generation, but at the time I purchased this, it was $21.99 before the latest round of tariffs. I checked Newegg and MSI's website directly. It is now $24.99, which is still not a bad price considering most of the other 5080 offerings are around $3,000 plus. Now, it doesn't have OLED, right? But it's still a very high quality IPS display. It's 240 hertz, it's IPS. It has 100% of the P3 color gamut. It's a little over 500 nits of brightness too. So if you don't mind the plastic chassis, which by the way is actually quite rigid, there's not a whole lot of flex or anything like that. It's a great value pick if you're looking for purely price to performance ratio. All right, let's quickly get into the specs now. So left-hand side, we have dual Thunderbolt 5s, as you can see here, and an SD card reader, which is quite nice. So dual Thunderbolt 5 is something I was very surprised at seeing in a sub $3,000 device with these kinds of specs. On the rear, which we still do have rear I/O, which is nice, we do have the MSI proprietary power plug. This unit comes with a 330 watt power brick. We have a Kensington lock, HDMI 2.1 for driving 4K 120 hertz displays, or 4K 240 with display stream compression. And then we have 2.5 gig instead of 1 gig LAN. And then lastly on this side, we have the combo audio headphone jack and 2 USB 3.2 Gen 2 Type A ports, which is 10 gigabits per second speed. So overall, a very nice balanced set of ports and a very surprising inclusion, like I said, of Thunderbolt 5 in a device at this price point. Let's talk a little bit more deeply about the chassis. So like I mentioned earlier, this is mostly plastic. I think the top lid might be metal, but everything else, including the the keyboard deck and bottom panel, this is all plastic. It's high quality plastic, right? Like I mentioned earlier, trying to torque this thing, there's really no give. Keyboard deck has very little flex when I'm pushing on it. Basically everywhere in the chassis, and there's no, like I said, there's no creaks. The trackpad is also plastic. It's probably similar to like the Mylar trackpads that you find on Lenovo Legions, the non-premium ones from the more recent Gen 8 and Gen 9 models. But it glides nicely, it tracks nicely, and has a nice audible click to it. Nothing super annoying or rattly when I tap on it. And the keyboard is actually pretty good. Like it's not per key RGB. I think it's like 26 or 28 zones. But I can get up to typing speed pretty quickly on the standard layout. The one thing I don't like is the non-standard smaller size 10 key. For gaming devices, I would either prefer this to be full size on like a 17 or an 18-inch device, or just get rid of it, center this completely, and call it a day. So this part I'm not super a fan of, but at least overall the actual typing experience was actually pretty nice. I didn't have any issues typing up some of my notes for this video in particular. One other thing I did briefly want to mention, I know some people do care about this quite a lot, the angle in which the screen can tilt back. So the furthest it can go is right about here. So it's not super far, but I mean, for all intents and purposes, most people at most viewing angles looking at this screen by themselves, this is totally fine. So it doesn't fold flat or super far back by any means, but it is something to call out. And then on the same topic, the hinges, they have this like interesting chromatic effect to it. It's like this like greenish purple tinge. They are very, like they feel very sturdy. Like there's not a whole lot of play to them when I try to like grab them or wiggle them. And like there's no like weird sounds or behavior when I'm like yanking on this thing. So I know MSIs have had some issues in the past with their hinges. I can't comment on the long-term longevity of these, but they do feel quite sturdy. Another thing that I wanted to very quickly touch upon was the advanced BIOS, because MSI, for the most part, offered their high-performance machines with the a fully unlocked BIOS. So they did get rid of the right control. As you can see, there's a Copilot key there, but it does work for the same key combination in its place. So it's the Copilot key, right shift, left alt, and F2, which will get you into the advanced BIOS, which I always say play with this at your own risk. But there is a whole lot of stuff in here you could do, including memory overclocking. You could touch the power limits, the PL1 and 2 and 4. You could do all sorts of things. You can remove a bunch of thermal limits. Again, do this at your own risk. But it's particularly interesting, I think, for most people, if they can dabble in it, would be memory overclocking, because the new Core Ultra architecture is a bit slow in terms of latency and memory bandwidth. Just something to consider if you do purchase this laptop. So another quick thing I wanted to call out, again, because this is more of a budget-oriented laptop, at least in terms of compared to the competition rocking the same specs. This does not have advanced Optimus or G-Sync, so you will have to rely purely on driving high frame rates if you want that buttery smooth sort of G-Sync like tear-free experience. I will say a 5080, which is more or less is equivalent to a 4090 mobile in most titles, they trade blows, is more than capable of delivering a great experience even without an adaptive sync technology such as G-Sync. And the panel itself is still very nice. Again, I know it's not OLED, I know it's not mini LED, but it is still, 500 plus nits, 240 hertz, QHD plus, so 2560 by 1600, as you can see here. Now, again, if this thing was a $3,000, $3,500 device, I would probably be complaining about the screen option and the lack of advanced Optimus. But I do have to give it a little, some slack, given that it is, much cheaper than the rest of the competition, like $500, $600 cheaper, not even including tax. So in terms of the factory installation, I didn't have to change too much. I didn't really have to remove a ton of bloatware or anything like that. The only thing that came with mine that I got rid of pretty quickly, because I usually just depend on the Microsoft's built-in antivirus / Defender service, was Norton. But really, other than that, I grabbed all of the updates from Windows Update directly, let it do its thing for a little while. Then I opened MSI Center, where you can control your fan speeds, your graphics mode, as you can see across the bottom of GPU switch, your performance mode, so extreme performance, balanced, and silent, which all of these things kind of worked pretty nicely even out of the box. So not a whole lot of tinkering and reinstalling to make sure these things worked. But like I mentioned earlier, right, so because there's no advanced Optimus, you will have to do like a reboot into DGPU or discrete graphics mode whenever you want like that absolute every ounce of performance, or if you're doing benchmarks. That being said, the later versions or branches of Windows support like cross-adapter scan-out, or CASO, however you want to enunciate it. So the performance penalty of staying in hybrid isn't supposed to be massive. It's supposed to be a few percent tops. So depending on how annoyed or how time limited you are to have to do a reboot every time you start gaming, I wouldn't worry about it too much. Again, if you're running the latest version of Windows. So getting inside isn't too difficult. There's a number of Phillips head screws that you have to take out. They're all the same size, and none of them are like hidden underneath any rubber pads or anything like that. You do have to take off this, I guess, top cover bar from the rear portion of the hinge, and then you can take this off. One thing to note is that the audio combo jack on the left-hand side here actually is protruding a little bit from the internal motherboard. As you can see, it's a little past the chassis here. So you want to make sure you take this side off first and you don't try to like yank it straight up. But this is a quick peek of the interior. So you have your two NVMe slots right here. You have your big 90 watt-hour battery across the bottom. I know it's not 100 watt-hours or the legal limit, which apparently that might be changing over the next 6 to 12 months to a larger size. So we'll see if laptop manufacturers follow suit post regulations. But overall, I mean, the cooling solution is pretty beefy, even though it's not a vapor chamber. There are revised fans year over year. I was actually speaking to an MSI representative over Discord, and these fans are revised. They have more blades, the thinner blades, to generate a little bit better static pressure. They are quite a bit loud, though, which I will talk about a little bit later in the video. But you know, everything's replaceable. Wi-Fi card here, the AX211, totally replaceable with its two antenna connectors. Like I said, the two NVMe slots, and then underneath this like insulating metal cover is your two SODIMM slots. Now, before I get into noise, thermals, and performance, I just wanted to very briefly remind everybody, this thing is not particularly thin or light. As anybody that's owned the Vector lineup before, it's a pretty thick laptop. It's about 1 inch thick. Not to mention the pretty big rubber feet across the bottom to give the fans on the bottom some breathing room. That being said, the charging brick did get a nice upgrade over the cheaper 300 and 330 watt offerings they had prior generations. It may be gallium nitride. I couldn't find any sort of material to say that it was, but it is significantly smaller than their last 300 watt brick. It is made by Delta. You can see the model number here, ADB330GB. It is pretty light too. I'll make sure I have a highlight on top of the video that shows the exact weight and dimensions. But charger size aside, this thing is not exactly lightweight, but it's it's not a 17 or an 18-inch device either, so you're not pushing 7-8 pounds. This is still closer to that 6-pound mark. Okay, so moving into synthetics for performance, we'll start with Cinebench R23. Both with a single run and 10-minute run. And just for clarity, I'm running all of these synthetic and gaming benchmarks with max fans to eliminate, variable fan speed as a variable, of course. So hopping right into it. So for a single run, I was able to just crack over 40,000 with the stock power limits and an extreme performance, again with max fans. And then with a little bit of an undervolt, and I've noticed that the Core Ultra architecture doesn't have a ton of undervolting headroom. I think at this point I was at like -60 or 65 millivolt on Core, and then -55 millivolt on cache. I was just under the 42,000 threshold. I'm sure by manipulating, priority and things like that, I could push beyond 42,000 pretty easily. And then for the 10-minute run, thermals were not really an issue in either of the scenarios. Of course, as the higher power limit expired and moved to I think it was a 120 or a 130 watt power limit sustained, we were still seeing above 36,000, which is, I think, fantastic given the power that it's consuming, which, for productivity workloads, the Core Ultra architecture is just all around more superior versus Raptor Lake, so 13900HX and 14900HX. Okay, so moving into GPU synthetics, I ran a few tests with 3D Mark, and I have TimeSpy, Steel Nomad, and Port Royal, and I ran all of these 3 times through and took the average, as well as did the same for overclocked, which was +100 core and +300 memory. I wanted very conservative metrics here, or conservative numbers for the overclock, just so I wasn't running into stability issues if someone else tried to copy those settings. Those are pretty conservative. So as you can see, the stock graphics score was just under 23,000. We're looking at 22,621. And then for Steel Nomad, we're at 5179. And Port Royal, we're at 14,416. So very, very comparable to a stock 4090 running at 175 watts as well. So most likely you'll see if you're running a 4090 laptop now, there really isn't much of a reason to sort of side grade unless you just deeply desire the multi-frame gen, which I would assume most people don't, unless you have mostly a first player gaming scenario where you're using a controller for most of most of the titles that you play. Overclocking brought us to just over 23,000 in TimeSpy, just under 5,300 in Steel Nomad, and just under 15,000 in Port Royal. Again, this is running, standard priority, not doing any sort of crazy, NVIDIA profile inspector tweaks to try to eke out more score. These are purely just stock and overclock metrics. Okay, so I ran a few gaming benchmarks as well, two of which I kind of just went into the training rooms and maxed out the settings, and then the latter two, so Shadow of the Tomb Raider and Black Myth Wukong, I used their in-game benchmarks. Very quickly, we'll run through the settings. So Marvel Rivals was on DLSS balanced using the new transformer model, running at the native 1600p resolution with all of the max or highest settings available with NVIDIA Reflex on. The Finals was also running at DLSS balanced with the new transformer model using a preset override, again with 1600p base resolution. All epic settings, including global illumination. And then Shadow of the Tomb Raider was the highest preset with TAA and no DLSS, so native 1600p resolution. And then finally, Black Myth Wukong was DLSS balanced with a 60 out of the 100 slider for the resolution. Frame generation was off, full ray tracing on very high, and then all cinematic settings, again with the 1600p base resolution. Then for clarity, so in Marvel Rivals and the Finals, I would go to a very specific spot that was reproducible, where there was a lot going on screen that kind of maximizes the render distance and everything else, and there's a lot of like on-screen action, so to speak. So this is kind of like a worst-case scenario where there's a lot of stuff on screen being rendered and you're looking far in the distance. And of course, these are all max settings, so if you're looking to play with competitive settings, you will very likely see well over 200 FPS in both of these titles, no problem. Okay, last but not least, we have dual load thermals, and this is, of course, rated for 175 on the GPU with 65 watts on the CPU in combined or dual load. In this test, I ran Cinebench R23 as well as Heaven Superposition at 8K to both have CPU and GPU at 100% utilization. And I ran this for just under 30 minutes. So you could see the chart on here. You have the average of the particular component temperature over the time frame. You have the last 2-minute average to see what it looks like closer to heat soak, and then the max, for a spike. And as you can see, these are very, very respectable numbers, right? Averaging under 80 on the CPU, while pulling around 62, 63 watts, and then around 71 C on the GPU, again pulling at 175 watts, give or take a watt or two. And then also memory temperatures were also great. So I know one of the things that a lot of companies struggled with last generation, unless they were using putty or aftermarket thermal pads for the GPU memory, those would be 96, 98, 100. So clearly GDDR7 is a little bit easier to cool given that it's more efficient. Okay, so moving on to address the elephant in the room is noise levels. So honestly, this is a loud machine, especially if you're not running this in tandem with like an aftermarket cooler like a GT500 or a Llano, and this thing can get pretty loud. So I have the 3 different power profiles that you would likely use while you're gaming. Most people will gravitate towards extreme performance so that you don't alter the GPU power that's available. You always want that 175 watts. So in balance, we were sitting in around 50 decibels, which is very reasonable. That is not too loud whatsoever. You could probably get away with using no headphones at this rate. But performance is going to be pretty limited when compared to, obviously, the extreme performance power profile, which the auto fan curve then creeps up to about 56 dB, or roughly 60% louder in terms of perceived volume. And again, every 10 decibels up is a roughly double the noise or perceived noise level, so take that into consideration. And then lastly, cooler boost, which I ran all of these tests on, was at 62 decibels. So very, very loud. Of course, you can run a custom fan profile with an extreme performance, so you could probably sit at the mid to high 50s and shave off, a good 10-20% of the perceived noise level. But ultimately, it's kind of a loud machine if you can look past that, or if you're just okay with using, noise canceling headphones while you're playing, while being cognizant of everybody around you if you're using this in public. So I think it ultimately comes down to a few main things for the pros and a few main things for the cons. So, on the plus side, this machine is very fast. It has great thermals out of the box, no need to repaste or anything like that. And it's pretty sturdy given that it's mostly a plastic build, right? So if you're not particularly concerned with, premium materials where you're looking at aluminum or magnesium alloy, and you're not bothered by sort of the chassis width and weight, this is a great pick. Noise level aside, if that's something you can look past. It is the cheapest 175 watt 5080 laptop available. So if you're not comfortable purchasing, a used or secondhand 4090 mobile machine, this will absolutely get you there. But some of the cons, if you are a person or individual that cares a lot about the materials that are used for the laptop, and you want a very premium feeling machine, think like the new G16, which is unibody, or a Razer Blade. This machine's not for you, right? This is mostly plastic. Again, it's not a premium design either, in that it's not super thin or compact by any means. But if you can look past those things, especially for the price, again, I had purchased this machine prior to the latest round of tariffs, so this was $21.99 plus tax for me. I believe at the time of recording, it has now been raised to either $24.99 on Newegg or $24.19 on MSI's website, but both are out of stock at the moment. But given the price point, I think these are all fair compromises. Now, if you don't want to make those compromises, I would start looking at maybe the new Legion Pro 7i, which a lot of people don't like the lack of rear ports that this does have. Perhaps maybe you want to take a gamble on the Aorus lineup. I know some reviews are coming out for those, with also running a 240 Hz OLED panel. So there are other options. They are between $500 to $600 more, if not more. I know the HP Omen Max 16 without the OLED panel is available at Best Buy for just over $3,000 US. But all that to say, this is a very respectable machine, especially if you look past the noise levels, or if you're very comfortable using, a custom fan profile to tweak and tune the noise that it's generating versus the temperatures under load and the performance you're looking for. I think this will work great for most folks.